In the late 1980s, the French town of Annemasse in Haute-Savoie was gripped by fear. Girls and young women were becoming targets of a dangerous criminal, attacked on the street, in elevators, or on stairwells. There was no safe haven, not even under the roof of their own homes. He would suddenly ambush his victims, bind them, gag them, and subject them to violence. Not all would survive encounters with the maniac. This investigation would yield many clues before the killer, with his particularly disturbing modus operandi, was unmasked. The press dubbed him the Monster of Annemasse, as if the perpetrator of these atrocities were not human. But the true horror lies in the fact that he was human, a fellow resident of Annemasse just like his young victims. This story began in March 1986 in the town of Annemasse, located in Haute-Savoie, near the Swiss border. On March 13th at 5:15 p.m., 13-year-old Guillaume Bouvier returned home from school. He wasn't alone. He was with his friend, Jérôme. The boys approached the apartment door, and Guillaume was about to turn the handle and enter, as he usually did. But to his surprise, the door was locked. He was puzzled, as his younger sister Sophie was always the first to come home from school. 10-year-old Sophie Bouvier was a very well-behaved girl, but she often ignored their mother's request to lock the door. Of course, Guillaume had his own set of keys somewhere at the bottom of his school bag. He searched for them, found them, and unlocked the door. Letting Jérôme in and stepping inside, Guillaume noticed a letter opener on the hallway table, one he had never seen before. He heard the sound of running water coming from his mother's room, and a few drops of water had somehow made their way into the hallway. Apart from this, the apartment was unusually quiet. As Guillaume wondered what it all could mean, the door to his mother's room suddenly opened, and a stranger stepped out. The man appeared completely calm and relaxed. He looked very young, and Guillaume thought he might be the older brother of one of Sophie's friends. In other words, the confused boy was trying to make sense of the stranger's presence in his home. Meanwhile, the man casually asked if Guillaume knew where his sister Sophie was. Guillaume, bewildered, shook his head. At that moment, the phone rang. Guillaume knew it was his mother calling. She phoned at the same time every day to make sure both of her children had made it home safely from school and that everything was okay. Guillaume approached the phone to answer it. It really was their mother. She asked if Sophie had come home, because when she called earlier, her daughter hadn't answered. Guillaume replied, "No, Mom, Sophie isn't here," and then asked who the man was that he had just encountered in their apartment. By then, the man had opened the door and left just as Guillaume picked up the phone. His mother didn't understand what man he was talking about and asked her son to check again if Sophie was really not home. Guillaume and Jérôme began searching the rather spacious apartment together. Guillaume opened the bathroom door and was paralyzed with horror. His little sister, young Sophie, was there. She was lying in the bathtub, submerged in water, completely naked. Her ankles and wrists were bound, tape was wrapped over her eyes, and a gag was stuffed in her mouth. Guillaume rushed to call for emergency services, while Jérôme carefully pulled the girl out of the water. He removed the gag from her mouth and attempted to administer first aid. Soon, emergency responders arrived and quickly took Sophie to the hospital. It was standard procedure, but they already knew that Sophie had died, and there was nothing they could do to save her. The police who arrived at the scene discovered that young Sophie Bouvier lived in a fairly upscale neighborhood with her mother and older brother. Her parents were both doctors. Her father had passed away just a year before Sophie's murder, and her mother, Michelle Bouvier, worked as a factory physician. Michelle was an exceptionally attentive and caring mother. Sophie attended school and spent her free time practicing dance. The school was only 300 meters away from her home, so all she had to do was cross the square to get back. Sophie would always come home at the same time each day. However, she had a habit of forgetting to lock the door, so her mother had attached a note to the door that read, "Sophie, be careful. Lock the door when you are alone in the apartment." Every day at the same time, her mother would call to make sure Sophie had returned home safely. This time, when Sophie didn't answer, her mother grew very worried. In the apartment, the police found the items the perpetrator had used: a gag, ropes, and adhesive tape. The gag was a pair of underwear cut in half and wrapped with adhesive tape to ensure it stayed securely in her mouth. The autopsy revealed that the killer had drowned Sophie in the bathtub. There were no signs of violent assault, but the perpetrator had touched her in intimate areas. The police found traces of male semen on a towel, indicating that the assailant had gratified himself without directly assaulting the girl. However, in 1986, semen evidence could not aid the investigation, as DNA analysis was not yet available. Sophie's older brother Guillaume and his friend Jérôme were questioned about the stranger they had seen in the apartment. The boys described a tall and very thin young man, wearing glasses with thick frames and dressed in plain brown clothing, more suited for an elderly person. The boys helped the police create a composite sketch of the suspect. The murder of the 10-year-old girl undoubtedly sent shockwaves through the city. The police were under immense pressure, but the investigation proved difficult as the killer had left very few clues. There was only a partial fingerprint, which was insufficient for any substantial use, and traces of semen found on the towel. The only witnesses, young Guillaume and Jerome, were traumatized and had only seen the murderer for a few seconds, so they couldn't provide a detailed description. However, the investigators weren't entirely at a dead end, because this crime reminded them of another similar case. The detectives remembered an attack that had occurred just 8 months prior, in June of the previous year, and in the same neighborhood. On June 21, 1985, 8-year-old Angelique was heading home for lunch. She entered the elevator of her building, followed by a man who pressed the button for the basement. Without wasting any time, the man attacked her, dragged her into the basement, tied her hands behind her back, sealed her mouth with adhesive tape, placed a noose around her neck, and began cutting her clothes with scissors. He then removed the tape from Angelique's mouth and ordered her to satisfy him. However, he did not kill his victim. He left Angelique sitting on a garbage bin with a bag over her head and fled the scene. But the nightmare was far from over for the young girl. In tears, she made her way back to the elevator where the man had attacked her. When she entered the elevator, the rope around her neck got caught in the door. Thankfully, the elevator's safety mechanism was triggered and it stopped. Had the elevator moved slightly higher, the rope would have strangled Angelique. She was found in the elevator, crying and screaming, but alive. Unfortunately, she was too traumatized to help create a composite sketch of the attacker, and the investigation into Angelique's assault remained stalled for 8 months. The assault on Angelique and the murder of Sophie bore several similarities, particularly in the way the attacker had cut the victim's clothing. A week after Sophie's murder, her mother contacted the police, reporting that she had found the clothes Sophie was wearing on the day of her death. The clothing had been hidden in a closet and was cut into pieces. Investigators had to acknowledge that a dangerous predator was at large, a rapist and killer who followed a ritualistic pattern, revealing a deeply unsettling personality. Continuing their investigation, the detectives found a third similar case that had occurred 3 months earlier. On December 14, 1985, 12-year-old Stephanie returned home from school. She entered the elevator, and a young man followed her in, pressing the button for the basement. When he attacked her, Stephanie screamed. The man threatened, "If you scream, I'll kill you, but if you stay quiet, I won't do anything." Of course, the girl didn't believe him. Stephanie kept screaming. The man dragged her into the basement, where to her horror, she saw a mattress laid out on the floor. The stranger placed her on the mattress, shoved a cloth into her mouth, which turned out to be a piece of his underwear, taped her eyes shut, and tied her up. He threatened her with a piece of glass he found nearby and began touching her intimate areas. Stephanie didn't stop fighting. Then the man started to strangle her, simultaneously blocking her nostrils. The girl panicked. She couldn't breathe anymore and realized he was going to kill her. She decided to act as if she were dead to make her attacker leave her alone. The trick worked. The man fled, and Stephanie survived. The girl described the same man to the police that Guillaume and Jerome had seen. The criminal was young, but looked like an old man because of his clothing. He had clearly prepared for the attack, as he had laid out the mattress and left pieces of tape stuck to the walls, which were meant to aid him in his sinister task. Sophie and Angelique's homes were 100 meters apart. Stephanie lived less than a kilometer away from the girls. So before Sophie's murder, 2 attacks on girls had taken place in the same area over the span of a few months. Why then did Sophie's mother allow her to return home alone? Because she had no idea about the other elevator attacks. These incidents hadn't been reported due to the upcoming elections, so the media didn't raise the alarm. But after Sophie's murder, it became impossible to conceal that a dangerous criminal had appeared in the city, attacking children in their own homes. The man himself resembled a teenager, though he wore strange clothing. It was then that the press coined the nickname the Annemasse Monster for him. Needless to say, all the parents were in a panic. No child was allowed to return home alone anymore. Police officers stood guard at the entrances to schools. Meanwhile, the police combined the 3 attacks into one case. However, aside from the description of the man, they still had nothing to go on. The letter opener led nowhere, as it was the most common model. As for the underwear the criminal used as a gag, the police went to stores that sold similar items and showed them a composite sketch. But it was all in vain. The police decided to share their only lead, the composite sketch, with the public. They sent the sketch to the media in the hope that someone would recognize the criminal. However, it was almost like hoping for a miracle, because the man in the composite sketch had no distinguishing features. He looked like any ordinary young man, resembling an office worker. It was no surprise that when the image of the killer appeared in the press, the police were overwhelmed with a flood of phone calls. Everyone in the city believed that their neighbor was the murderer. Hundreds of calls, each one needing to be investigated. They took up a lot of officers' time. A month after Sophie's murder, a report came in about a truly suspicious man. He was seen standing near a school, not just any school, but the one Sophie had attended. The suspicious man had been noticed by the parents of students. The police set up an ambush, and the man soon appeared. During the arrest, he trembled like a leaf and began crying. He was taken to the station for identification. Sophie's brother Guillaume and his friend Jerome immediately pointed to the suspect. However, the man had an alibi for the day of the murder. He was a bank employee and had been at work on March 13th at 5:15 p.m., as confirmed by his boss. So what had he been doing near the school? The man confessed that he wasn't interested in little girls, but rather a young, attractive woman who drove her son to school. He had been gathering the courage to talk to her for several days. Thus, it was yet another false lead. But still, Guillaume and Jerome had both identified the man. After the boys made the mistake, the police decided to protect them from frequent lineups to avoid compromising their testimonies. However, fate intervened when the teenager unexpectedly encountered the killer himself. On February 11, 1987, 14-year-old Guillaume was walking through the center of Annemasse when he suddenly noticed a man he had seen at his house on that fateful day. He was as shocked as he had been during their first encounter, but there was no doubt in his mind that this was his sister's killer. The man also noticed the boy and quickly entered a nearby store. Guillaume followed him into the store, moving between the aisles. The man went outside, looked around, saw the boy still following him, crossed the street, quickened his pace, and entered a bar. Guillaume hid behind a car and waited. The man did not leave the bar. The boy really could have used a mobile phone, but at that time they simply didn't exist, so Guillaume ran to the nearest phone booth and called the police. The police arrived very quickly and cordoned off the bar, but the man was already gone. While the boy was calling the police, he had slipped away. No one had ever doubted that the killer and rapist was a local resident. Now that assumption was confirmed. Sophie's mother found it hard to push away the thought that the killer was living his life freely. On a sunny day, she thought he was probably sitting on the terrace of a cafe, drinking coffee, while her daughter Sophie lay in a cold grave. Nevertheless, Sophie's mother and brother continued to live in the same apartment. At first, her mother had wanted to move, but then she realized that it was their home, the place where they had been happy as a family, where Sophie had been happy. On the other hand, thanks to Guillaume's accidental encounter with the suspect, the police were able to improve and update the composite sketch of the suspect. Now the man was depicted wearing round metal frame glasses and had grown a mustache. The updated sketch was once again published in the media in the hope that someone would recognize the changes in the appearance of someone they knew. Indeed, the police were once again flooded with calls. Officers followed up on each lead, but once again, they received no results. 2 more years passed. On a cold January day in 1989, 15-year-old Sylvie came home from school. She took out her keys in front of her apartment door, unlocked it, and was about to enter as usual when someone suddenly attacked her from behind and shoved her into the apartment. The girl immediately screamed. The stranger tried to choke her with one hand, but she managed to break free and screamed again. In the hallway of the apartment, there was a low table with a vase on it. While Sylvie struggled with the attacker, the vase crashed to the floor. This startled the man, and he ran away. The police immediately interviewed the girl, and here's what she described. The attacker had covered his face with a stocking, so she couldn't identify him, but he was tall, thin, and wearing gloves. He hadn't had the chance to tie her up with ropes or cover her eyes with tape, but he was holding a small bottle with a clear liquid that resembled water. The police speculated that it was chloroform, which meant the suspect they were looking for was evolving and seeking new ways to quickly and effectively incapacitate his victims. They were convinced that the man who attacked Sylvie was the Annemasse monster. Yes, Sylvie was a little older than his previous victims, and he didn't have ropes or tape, but there were many other similarities. His build, the way he attacked, and the gloves. After all, at Sophie's crime scene, forensic experts hadn't found any fingerprints either. 6 months later, another attack occurred. On August 20th, 1990, 21-year-old Natalie was returning from a party at 1:30 in the morning. She had gotten a bit lost and was walking along a bridge leading to the highway when a man suddenly attacked her from behind. He dragged her under the bridge, tied her up, undressed her, and was about to assault her when Natalie, who had some developmental disabilities, unexpectedly consented. However, the man had planned to commit violence, not engage in consensual sex, and, shocked and confused by this turn of events, he abandoned the bound, naked girl and ran away. Natalie was found wearing only her bra with her clothes cut to pieces. At the station, Natalie told the police that the man had a stocking on his head, so she couldn't see his face. But she remembered that he had a backpack and a small glass bottle. He poured liquid from the bottle onto a piece of cloth, then held it to her face, causing her consciousness to become foggy. This confirmed the hypothesis of chloroform use. The police observed a clear evolution in the killer's modus operandi. He was no longer the one who prowled apartments and basements. Now he was moving around the city center with a backpack containing ropes, tape, and chloroform. The police decided to act on this new information. They started stopping all men aged 25 to 30 moving through the city with a backpack. This wasn't an entirely unrealistic task, because according to the 1990 census, Annemasse had a population of 27,500. Their persistence paid off. One deep March night in 1991, officers were called to a burglary scene. While working at the crime site, they accidentally noticed a man with a backpack who tried to flee when they arrived. The man was quickly caught and thrown to the ground. He was wearing a woman's stocking around his neck, wrapped as if it were a scarf, which appeared suspicious. They searched his backpack, and inside they found ropes, duct tape, and chloroform. The man was taken to the station, where investigators discovered his name, Lucien Gilles Devalier. He was 24 years old. The investigators asked him what he was doing out so late with all these items in his backpack. The man claimed that he had been attacked some time ago and was looking for his attackers. However, he couldn't explain why he thought he would find them in that particular area at that hour, nor why he had run from the police when they arrived. At that moment, the investigator realized that the man sitting before him resembled the suspect they had been searching for over the past 6 years. However, the young man had no prior police record. The police decided to search his home, where he lived with his mother. On his desk, they found a camera. The window was covered with thick paper with a small round hole in it, perfect for a camera lens. They also found 2 large folders, neatly containing 4,200 photographs of girls, young women, and women. Lucien Gilles Devalier had been photographing women walking down the street, exiting stores, and getting into cars. He had categorized them by hair color, brunettes, blondes, and brunettes, and had rated them. Some photos included addresses and phone numbers. Additionally, officers discovered adult magazines and clippings from newspapers about the Annemasse monster. The officers had no doubt. They had found the Annemasse monster, but the police had little evidence. The composite sketch had been circulating for 6 years, and all the photographs and notes would be of little use in court. So the investigator decided to bluff. He told the suspect that, with all the materials they had found, they had a serious case against him, and the young man confessed. Later, he explained that he thought they would beat him, which is why he confessed. In any case, it turned out that he remembered every attack in the finest detail, recalling each one almost minute by minute. But that wasn't all. He also confessed to other attacks that the police didn't know about. He had assaulted 3 girls in Geneva and 3 more in the outskirts of Annemasse. With the exception of one incident where his victim was a 15-year-old girl, he typically targeted older girls. The attacks took place in parking lots or simply on the street, so he didn't always have time to pull out ropes or tape. This is probably why these incidents hadn't initially been connected to him. Most of these were unsuccessful attacks for him because the girls fought back and screamed, forcing him to flee quickly. Once he came close to being caught. In January 1991, he targeted a new victim. He had seen her close the blinds in her house and hastily concluded that she lived alone. The rapist broke into the house and attacked the girl in the bathroom. She screamed and her boyfriend rushed to help. The man chased the attacker, but during the pursuit, he tripped, fell, and injured his arm so badly that he could no longer work as a mechanic. Lucien Gilles Devalier managed to escape and continued planning his future attacks. It turned out that the guy killed Sophie when he was only 18 years old. How did he come to commit murder at such a young age? There were many events in his life that could explain this. Of course, not justify, but only explain. His mother adored him, doted on him, and spoiled him. His father, a brilliant mathematics teacher on the other hand, was quite strict and unemotional. The family relationship wasn't the warmest, but overall, he had a happy childhood. That is, until a man in his 50s lured him into a basement when he was 9 years old. He forced the boy to give him pleasure. The boy was in shock after what happened, and he found it difficult to tell his parents. So he wrote everything down in a letter. But his parents did nothing, fearing scandal. They told him not to talk to anyone about it. When the boy's parents did not go to the police, it was as if they were telling him, "You can survive such a horrifying event and the law will not intervene." The parents acted as if nothing had happened. The result was inevitable. The boy brushed his teeth 10 times a day, as if trying to wash away the dirt of what had happened. From a very young age, he developed a passion for sadomasochism. He would tie himself up, put a gag in his mouth, and inflict pain on himself. By the age of 12, he began dressing as a girl. At first, only at home, but by the age of 16, he would go out in public dressed that way. Later, he admitted how much he wanted someone to attack him. By then, his parents had divorced, and he lived with his mother. When his mother found his women's clothing, she did not attempt to understand what was happening with her son, but simply threw them away. At that moment, Lucien Gilles Duvalier transformed from a victim into a predator. He no longer saw women as individuals, but as objects, wanting them to submit to his desires. He said that he had been in love with a girl during his teenage years and saw in Sophie's smile the smile of that girl he had loved, except that Sophie was only 10 years old. Before attacking her, he scoped out the area. He rode the elevator with her a few times, even learned her name through a brief exchange of polite words. A few days later, he returned and hid in a storage room, waiting for Sophie to come home. Once inside the apartment, he gagged her and stripped her naked. Sophie was undoubtedly terrified, clutching her teddy bear as if it could protect her. It's difficult to imagine what she felt when she heard the phone ring. She knew it was her mother calling and probably thought her mom would come to her rescue. Meanwhile, the attacker led Sophie to the bathroom, as it was part of his fantasy. He was aroused by the wet bodies of young girls. After satisfying his lust, he held Sophie underwater with his foot until she stopped moving. A few days after killing Sophie, he wrote in his diary, "It wasn't so bad." While he continued to commit crimes that grew more horrific, he seemed perfectly integrated into society. Lucien Gilles Duvalier was an excellent student, loved roller skating, was interested in computers, and dated girls. 3 months after he killed Sophie, holding her underwater with his foot, he successfully enrolled in an undergraduate program. At the time of his arrest, he was studying chemistry at the University of Geneva. The young man seemed to suffer from a split personality, though psychiatrists disputed this. He was evaluated by 2 psychiatrists and a psychologist who concluded that he was exceptionally intelligent, experienced no hallucinations, delusions, or schizophrenia, and was fully aware of his actions. This meant he was fit to stand trial. Thus, he was initially tried for acts of violence and sentenced to 7 years. On December 6, 1993, he appeared in court for the murder of Sophie, the attempted murder of Stephanie, and the assault of Natalie, who suffers from developmental disabilities, which served as an aggravating factor. When he took the stand, according to his lawyer's recollections, he looked like a movie star, a horror movie star, 6 feet tall, weighing around 130 pounds with a childlike face. When he spoke, he did so entirely without emotion. He explained that he hadn't intended to kill Sophie, but when he saw the water in the bathtub, he felt an impulse he couldn't resist. He told the murdered girl's mother that he felt disgusted with himself, and if his death could bring her daughter back, he would give his life immediately and without hesitation. He claimed he'd used warm water when he filled the tub for Sophie, as if that made any difference. Lucien Gilles Duvalier felt no remorse. Unlike many defendants, he didn't put on a show. He remained cold, detached, and rather self-centered. For example, when the investigator wanted to reenact the crime, the young man refused to go. The police insisted. Then he stated, "What you're doing is inhumane, bringing me to that place." A psychiatrist who took the stand testified that the young man was extremely dangerous because he used his sharp mind and meticulousness in service of his impulses to rape and kill. He experienced some difficulties in sexual matters, which drove him to seek new forms of gratification. At that time, psychiatry had no treatment to offer him. Experts unanimously affirmed that he was beyond rehabilitation. According to his lawyer, there should have been 4 people in the defendant's place: Lucien Gilles Duvalier himself, the 50-year-old man who had assaulted him, and his parents. After all, his mother saw all the evidence in her son's room, but never did or said anything. Doesn't she bear some responsibility for his actions? Despite all of the lawyer's efforts, the court did not take any mitigating circumstances into account. The 26-year-old man was found guilty of the assault and murder of Sophie, as well as attacks on 2 other girls. He was sentenced to the maximum punishment, life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 30 years. However, he appealed this decision, eventually securing eligibility for parole after 22 years. Despite numerous attempts to gain release, he is still serving his sentence in prison. After all, he's relatively young and could easily ruin more lives if released. But if he couldn't secure his freedom, he aimed to have his case forgotten. The convicted man decided to take action and, in 2019, filed a request with Google to delist news articles about his case. His request was denied. August 1988. 9-year-old Delphine Boulet set off with her brother Nicolas to a scout camp near Deauville, France. Nicolas had been spending his summers in the secluded camp, nestled in a picturesque location, for 2 years in a row and had always had a wonderful time. This year, his younger sister joined him, but the last week of summer vacation, which should have been filled with joy and laughter, turned into a nightmare. One night, while she was supposed to be sleeping peacefully in her tent, Delphine vanished without a trace. The camp was not as safe as the children's parents had believed, and if not for chance, the pleasant guy with a dark gaze, as the abductor was described by his friends, might never have been caught, and the case might have remained unsolved. The Boulet family had always lived in the Paris region, in Issy-les-Moulineaux. Alain and Marie-Josée Boulet were raising 2 wonderful children, their son Nicolas and his younger sister, Delphine. For 2 summers in a row, Nicolas had spent his holidays at a scout camp. In 1988, his 9-year-old sister Delphine joined him. The trip took place in August, during the last week of vacation before the new school year began. Wanting to make their daughter happy, her parents let her spend a week in the great outdoors at the camp. Like many parents, Alain and Marie-Josée felt a twinge of anxiety at sending their children away for so long, but they were confident the camp would provide proper supervision. They would soon learn, however, that this was not the case. Early on the morning of Saturday, August 27, 1988, the phone rang in the Boulet family's home. Alain picked up the receiver. It was the director of the camp where his children were staying. "She is no longer at the camp," the man said. He repeated the phrase 2 or 3 times, but Alain couldn't comprehend it. The words simply wouldn't fit in his mind, a thought he refused to believe. What did it mean that his daughter was no longer at the camp? Where was she? When the director finally managed to convey that they could not find the girl, Alain knew he had to leave immediately and go there. The scout camp was located in Villerville, a small village just a few kilometers from Deauville, right on the seashore. The village is famous as the filming location of A Monkey in Winter, based on the novel by Antoine Blondin, starring Jean Gabin and Jean-Paul Belmondo. Those familiar with this classic of French cinema will remember the scene where the 2 main characters stand behind the counter of the Le Cabaret Normand restaurant, filmed right there in Villerville. The camp itself was set in nature, on an elevated spot, offering a magnificent view of the coast. It consisted of 3 tents, housing around 20 or 25 children. Among them were only 2 girls, Delphine and her 10-year-old tent mate, Marlene. On the morning of Saturday, August 27, Marlene woke to find, to her surprise, that Delphine was not beside her. She quickly went to inform the camp leaders. Staff searched for Delphine, but as the tents were in the middle of nowhere, there were no nearby places where the girl could have wandered on her own. They quickly realized they would not be able to find her themselves. They informed her parents of her disappearance and called emergency services. A large-scale search operation was launched. More than 200 gendarmes were mobilized, joined by firefighters and volunteers. They combed through several square kilometers of terrain. Helicopters, divers, and canine units were brought in. Not a single ditch, grove, field, or meadow was left unsearched. At the time, everyone assumed that Delphine had left the camp on her own. Several details seemed to support this idea. First, she had gone in her shoes and taken a flashlight. Second, the day before her disappearance, there had been a small incident. Delphine had lost her scout troop flag. She might have dropped it near the old aquarium in the village of Trouville-sur-Mer, which the children had visited. Police speculated that the girl might have set out to look for it there. Of course, this theory was checked, but it led nowhere. But even if the girl had decided to leave on her own, that didn't change the fact that such a venture was extremely dangerous for a child. This part of Normandy is marshy, wooded, and largely sparsely populated. Not only was the terrain itself hazardous, but she might have encountered wild animals, or died from hunger or thirst. On the other hand, the area had many farms and barns where she could have found shelter. And as a scout, she would, in theory, have been able to survive and even feed herself for several days. On one farm, a discarded apple core was found, and for some reason it was assumed to have been left by Delphine. After 3 days of searching, Police were convinced that the girl had, for some reason, left the camp on her own and was now afraid to return, fearing punishment. Delphine's parents could not simply sit back. Each day, they rose at dawn and went to bed late, taking part in the search for their daughter and posting leaflets appealing to anyone who might have seen her. Alain, the girl's father, told reporters that his daughter was quite strong and resilient for her age, loved walking, and could have covered several kilometers, but he did not truly believe she had run away. Like many children, she was shy, and running away did not fit her character at all. Delphine grew up in a very close and loving family. She was close to her brother Nicolas. She was intelligent, a good student, and had many hobbies, particularly dance. There were no problems at home or at school, and she had no reason to run away. Even so, Alain did not rule out any theory that might explain his daughter's disappearance. He took a loudspeaker and began driving through the region in his car. "Delphine, it's Papa. Show yourself. You won't be scolded. I'm begging you, darling. Come out to Papa," he repeated over and over. He drove like this for hours on end, pleading with his daughter to stop hiding. He held on to the hope that she had simply run away and was afraid to come back to her parents for fear of being punished. Because if it wasn't a runaway, then Delphine's fate could be far worse. And he didn't want to think about that. But the more time passed, the more both the parents and the police began to wonder if this truly wasn't a runaway. The prosecutor opened a criminal investigation. On September 6th, about 20 kilometers from Villerville, a man out gathering mushrooms came across a partially burned body. When the police arrived, they confirmed it was the body of a young girl. It was in a terrible state. It had clearly been doused with a flammable liquid to intensify the flames. Officers also found a rope that had been used to bind the victim. The girl had been struck several times at the back of the head against rocky ground, and there were signs of strangulation. However, she had not been strangled with hands or rope. It was more likely caused by some sort of gag forced into her mouth. Since parents often keep their children's first baby teeth, investigators compared one such tooth with remains from the burned body. Thanks to this tooth, the victim was identified as Delphine Boulet. Because she had first been struck on the head, there was hope that she had already been dead when set on fire and had not felt it. From experience, investigators in such cases immediately suspected they were dealing with a sexual assault followed by murder, with the fire set in an attempt to destroy evidence. It was clear the case had taken an entirely new turn, and after the discovery of the girl's body, the police began searching for her killer. Naturally, suspicion immediately fell on the camp staff. There were 5 of them in total, including the camp director. They conducted themselves with dignity, understanding that the police were simply doing their job. They insisted on their innocence and were soon released, as there was no evidence suggesting their involvement. Time passed, and the police still had no new suspects. They interviewed around 3,500 people, hoping that locals in the area might know something. They looked into possible involvement by individuals previously convicted in cases involving attacks on children. Unfortunately, it was a complete failure. The investigation had not moved forward an inch. Officers feared that if the attack had been committed by someone who didn't know the family and had never been in trouble with the law before, finding him would be possible only by sheer luck. Incredibly, it was luck that eventually helped solve the case. It was autumn 1990. Remy Boivin, a restaurateur from Deauville, accidentally discovered a briefcase in an apartment provided to one of his employees. The briefcase was filled with newspaper clippings about the tragedy at the camp, many clippings. But most importantly, there was more than just that inside. Inside the briefcase was a letter confessing to Delphine's murder. The letter was addressed to the girl's mother, although she had, of course, never received it. The author wrote that he was drawn to sexually assaulting and killing girls. He said he saw Delphine in town and liked her. He wrote, "She will be mine in 4 days. Later, you will find her body. It will be cold, and the body will be completely naked. She will be assaulted and strangled. That's all. I wanted to warn you." The letter was written by Remy's employee, a dishwasher at his restaurant, 29-year-old Gerard Labourg. Gerard was immediately taken into custody. He did not resist. The man gave a detailed confession about Delphine's murder and the abuse she suffered. Gerard explained that he had stumbled upon the children's camp completely by chance during a walk. Instantly, a plan formed in his mind. He bought gasoline at a Deauville gas station and stocked up on ropes, cotton for a gag, and bed sheets. On August 26th, he hid in a cornfield and spent part of the night there, showing great patience. Finally, he heard the distinctive sound of a tent zipper opening. He then saw a child walking with a flashlight toward a nearby tree, likely to use the restroom. Leaving the cornfield, Gerard followed the girl, grabbed her from behind, gagged her with cotton, wrapped her in a sheet, put her in his car, and drove to the edge of a small forest. There, he pulled Delphine out of the car. Gerard tied her up with ropes, committed an assault, then struck her several times on the back of the head with great force. He doused the lifeless body with gasoline, threw the gas canister onto her, and set her on fire, without removing the ropes that bound her. Then he fled the scene. It was a very detailed account. Detectives had no doubt that Gerard was telling the truth, as he knew details the police had not shared with the press. Gerard Leberg had never come under police scrutiny before, although investigators later found it was not because he hadn't committed any crimes. His family had long noticed unusual behaviors that gradually grew into a terrifying obsession. His mother's boyfriend once caught Gerard inappropriately looking at pictures of children. This was the first warning sign, which the family, unfortunately, paid little attention to. In 1984, 4 years before the tragedy at the scout camp, he attempted to harm his 10-year-old niece Sandra when they were alone in the house. One evening, they both went down to the basement where he started inappropriate behavior towards Sandra, but did not complete his actions. Fortunately, he did not succeed. However, he threatened his niece if she told anyone. The family did not report this to the police. Gerard's mother, to her credit, did not cover for her son and insisted he be admitted to the city psychiatric hospital. Gerard dutifully underwent treatment, but as soon as he left the clinic, he harmed his 7-year-old cousin. It seemed that he should have ended up in prison back then, and little Delphine might have been spared. But Gerard slipped through the cracks of the law. Both Gerard himself and his niece and cousin were part of an extremely dysfunctional family, where even without Gerard's actions, conditions were far from normal. Besides Gerard, there were 9 children in the family. Though raised is too strong a word, the parents neglected the well-being and education of the children and committed serious offenses. The father abused one of his daughters. One sister took her own life because of this, and the mother left the children and ran away with a new partner. Such a home environment was certainly not conducive to fostering love or warmth. At 29 years old, Gerard had never had relationships with adult women, even for money. His only interests were magazines and catalogs from which he cut out photographs of children. Colleagues recalled that he liked reading detective novels, but only those that involved crimes against minors. At the restaurant in Deauville where he worked seasonally, nobody really noticed Gerard. They described him as a pleasant guy with a dark look. He was silent. No one knew that in his free time he drew disturbing pictures in notebooks. On January 23, 1991, the police and prosecution conducted a reconstruction of the crime. Gerard agreed to participate. To ensure maximum accuracy, everyone gathered near the tree where Delphine was killed, deep in the night. The weather was very cold, but Gerard obediently and thoroughly demonstrated how the crime took place. He reenacted the assault scene and then set fire to a mannequin representing the victim. It was so realistic and horrifying that one of the gendarmes, who had served for many years, could not hold back his tears. The trial began in May 1992. Gerard was tried both for the murder of Delphine and for what he had done to his niece and cousin. Despite his confession and participation in the crime reconstruction, Gerard pleaded not guilty. Throughout the trial, he kept his head down and never looked up. Even when Delphine's father, Alain Boulet, spoke, the man stood up and with incredible dignity and without shedding a single tear, spoke about his little daughter. He began with the words, "I dreamed of inviting Delphine to dance with me on her 18th birthday." His speech made a huge impression on the jury, as did the evidence against Gerard, including his letter, confession, and the crime reconstruction. There was no doubt about his guilt. The prosecutor demanded a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 30 years, and added that 15 years earlier, he would have demanded the death penalty. His request was granted. This punishment is considered the maximum penalty in France. Gerard did not react to the verdict. He was sent to prison, where he died at the age of 44. In Issy-les-Moulineaux, where the Boulet family lives, a garden was created in honor of little Delphine. It was opened 15 years ago on September 26, 2010. At the entrance, a photo of the little girl was installed, a photo where she smiles just as she always did before the man who took away her right to grow up and live the life she wanted crossed her path. Delphine's parents joined other families of missing and murdered children to create the Association of Parents of Victim Children. This organization still exists today and supports more than 250 families across the country. Most importantly, it initiated the creation of a genetic database that helps track sex offenders in France. Gingin is an unremarkable little Australian town with a population of around 1,000 people. A quiet place, bathed in bright sunlight and surrounded by endless fields stretching to the horizon in every direction. Gingin has just one main street, lined with a handful of shops. There's a gas station, a couple of pubs, of course, and not much else. Entertainment in the town is virtually non-existent, leaving teenagers with few opportunities to have fun. The nearest big city isn't exactly close, so life here can feel uneventful and lonely. It was in this very town that 17-year-old Phoebe Bishop lived, a sensitive girl trying to find her place in the world, a young rebel struggling to cope with the challenges life had thrown at her, filled not only with bitterness and disappointment, but also with hope. Phoebe was in love and she didn't hide it. At school, she met Levi, a boy a year older than her. The two began dating, but after a tragedy struck Levi's family, he had to move to the other side of the country. Still, Phoebe and Levi kept in touch every day and planned to see each other when Phoebe would visit him in Perth. For months, she saved money for the trip to her beloved, and finally, the ticket was bought and the date of the flight set. At last, the long-awaited May 15th, 2025 arrived, the day Phoebe was supposed to leave for Perth. Her neighbors, Tanika and Jason, helped her load her things into the car, and together with Jason's dog, they drove her to Bundaberg Airport. At 8:30 in the morning, just minutes before she was due to board, Phoebe called Levi, and after that, she vanished. The girl seemed to have disappeared into thin air. She never boarded the plane. When, hours later, Levi was waiting for her in Perth and she never showed up, the heartbroken young man rushed to blame himself, thinking she had changed her mind about coming. Phoebe's phone didn't answer because, as it turned out, it had been switched off right after that call at 8:30 in the morning. She hadn't used her bank account since May 14th. The next day, Phoebe was officially declared missing, and her mother, Kylie Jensen, made a public appeal, begging for help in finding her daughter. Kylie was certain Phoebe would never have run away from home, despite the fact that the family situation was far from ideal for a teenage girl. Just before her disappearance, Phoebe made an intriguing social media post. It was a theoretical conversation she imagined having with her younger self. For a time, this was a popular trend where people would ask, "What wise words would I give to my younger self if I had the chance?" Phoebe's post turned out to be a revelation, shedding light on her life in the final days before she vanished. She wrote, "I met a younger version of myself when I walked into a cafe to have a coffee. She was dressed in baggy, boyish clothes, her hair loose and covered in piercings. I was dressed more femininely, long trousers and a not-too-short blouse. My hair was tied back in a bun, and I only had one piercing left." She sat down, glaring at every cafe customer with a destructive look. She ordered an iced coffee. When I came in, I greeted everyone with a smile, and they smiled back. I quietly sat down and smiled at her before ordering myself some water. She didn't say anything. She could hardly look me in the eyes. Her answers were short, her patience stretched thin. She flared up instantly. I asked, "Are you okay?" She answered, "Like you really care?" I said, "I am you." She looked at me carefully, then burst into tears, quickly jumped across the table, and fell into my arms. She looked me in the eyes and I could see she had so many questions. I hurried to tell her it was okay to ask questions. That's how you get answers. A tear rolled down her cheek. She smiled and asked me, "Are Mom and I on good terms? Did I finally make her proud?" I answered, "She will never be proud. We don't see or talk to her anymore, but that's for the best." She was shocked. She never thought she'd stop caring about her relationship with her mother. "Do I still live at home?" she asked. I said that we'd moved in and out for years, but this time we wouldn't return. "What about brothers and sisters? Don't we need them?" she asked. I looked at her, my heart breaking, and answered, "Oh, sweetheart, we'll always need them, but it's far more important that they choose to need us." She protested angrily. "But we're just kids." I looked at her and said, "This year we'll turn 18. They're all gone, all living different lives." She looked at me and asked only, "What do we do? How do we stop time?" I simply looked at her with a smile and said, "You can't stop time, sweetheart. Time is all we have." "Want to know something cool?" I asked her. Her eyes looked worried, her face flushed. Anyone else would think she wanted to hit someone, but I just held her tighter and let her cry. I told her everything was okay. I knew it was scary, but it was going to be all right. She said, "All time does is take, it never gives." I lifted her chin gently, smiled and said, "It gave you a niece." Her eyes widened, lit up, and she began to cry again. She asked when she could meet her. I hugged her and said I'd bring her next time I came for coffee. I hope I meet my younger self again for coffee soon. Phoebe's post is poetic, emotional, and deeply revealing. It speaks for itself. It makes clear what she was feeling before her disappearance. Her relationship with her mother was fragile. She had run away from home several times, and her sisters and brother all had their own lives. Phoebe was stuck between childhood and adulthood, feeling lonely, as if everyone had abandoned her. Despite being only 17, she saw herself as less angry and aggressive than before, more composed, more sensitive, but also perhaps more emotionally drained. At the same time, she was overjoyed by the birth of her niece. It showed that despite all the pain, she still believed in love and family support. She came across as wise beyond her years, yet vulnerable and full of hope in the way only a 17-year-old can be. Shortly before her disappearance, Phoebe reached out to her aunt, her mother's sister, Kaz Johnson. She wrote to Kaz that her mother had told her to get out of the house. When she asked her father if she could stay with him, he simply replied, "No." Phoebe didn't share the details and promised to explain later, but she never had the chance. What's striking is that Phoebe and her Aunt Kaz hadn't been in touch for several years when the girl suddenly decided to write. She managed to share one piece of joyful news. She would soon be traveling to Perth to spend time with her boyfriend. Phoebe also confided that she wished she never had to return to Gingin after the trip. Kaz was deeply worried when she read her niece's messages because she knew her sister Kylie would never throw her child out of the house. But it was clear that Phoebe hadn't felt comfortable at home for some time. For a while, she had even slept in her car, until 33-year-old Tanika Bramley and her 34-year-old boyfriend James Wood invited her to stay with them. But why them? What could a 17-year-old girl possibly have in common with a couple in their early 30s? Apart from the fact that they lived in a tiny town of just 1,000 people, where everyone knew everyone else, Tanika knew Phoebe's mother, Kylie Johnson. Kylie ran a company that provided services and support to people with disabilities who received financial assistance from the government. In other words, the state provided funding that individuals with disabilities could spend on a variety of services offered by the company, things like help around the house, assistance with shopping, paperwork, and much more. Essentially, the company's staff helped people with various disabilities gain greater independence and lead more comfortable lives. Tanika had previously worked for Kylie as a support worker. The two women had been friends, but they fell out after Kylie fired Tanika the previous year. Phoebe herself had also worked part-time for the company and, according to some sources, even received disability support payments from the government. In other words, Phoebe had known Tanika for a long time. Tanika's boyfriend James also insisted that he considered Phoebe a wonderful, polite kid. He said that if he had a younger sister who was forced to live out of her car, he would want someone to step in and help her too. Naturally, the police questioned Tanika and James, since they were the ones who had driven Phoebe to the airport. And the story they told was more than curious. According to them, in the days leading up to her flight, Phoebe had been both thrilled and restless, caught up in the anticipation of finally visiting her boyfriend. She worried about what to wear, what to pack, how not to miss the plane. On the morning of the flight, she had planned to wake up at 5 a.m. But James told her he wasn't going to get up that early. The airport wasn't far, he said, though in truth it was about 50 kilometers away. Of course, there was no risk of big city traffic jams, but an earlier start might not have been a bad idea. James claimed that Phoebe overslept, then flew into a rage when she realized. Emotional outbursts weren't unusual for her, and usually he and Tanika could calm her down. But this time she wouldn't settle. In fact, he said, she even smashed the television. That detail raises serious doubts. Hard to believe a teenage girl could break a TV and the adults in the house would remain so calm. Yet James insisted Phoebe kept spiraling, screaming that she had nothing to wear, desperate to look attractive when reuniting with her boyfriend after such a long separation. In an effort to defuse the situation, James handed her his new track pants and told her to wear them. At first she resisted, but eventually she agreed and put them on. He added that, even with the delays, they still had plenty of time to make her flight, which he claimed departed at 10 a.m. Although the police, media, and Phoebe's family later insisted she was supposed to be at the airport by 8:30. By around 8 a.m., Jason had gone to a nearby shop to buy energy drinks, and when he returned, Phoebe's oversized duffel, almost as big as she was loaded into Tanika's silver 2011 Hyundai hatchback. They all piled in with Jason's dog. Tanika drove, Phoebe sat in the back. Somewhere along the way, Phoebe phoned Levi. Later, Levi confirmed she had called, but he said he couldn't make out much. She was being shouted at from both sides, and the call was chaotic. James, of course, denied that anyone had raised their voice. Phoebe, he said, was still upset, complaining she hadn't had time to put on makeup. Tanika handed back her own makeup bag, telling Phoebe to take whatever she wanted. She could always freshen up during her layover in Brisbane, but Phoebe wouldn't let it go. She wanted to look beautiful from the very beginning of the trip. So, in a desperate attempt to calm her down, Tanika pulled the car over about 1.5 miles from the airport. She and James got out, leaving Phoebe alone in the car with her luggage, to give her a few minutes to cool off. Just imagine, Phoebe was already running late. She had been running late ever since Jason casually stopped for energy drinks at 8 a.m. And now, instead of rushing to check in, the two adults thought the best idea was to abandon a distressed teenager on the side of the road. They walked for 5, maybe 8 minutes. But when they came back, Phoebe and her bag were gone. Jason and Tanika assumed she had decided to walk the rest of the way to the terminal, on foot, dragging a bag nearly as heavy as she was. They drove to the airport, hoping to spot her along the road, but saw nothing. They waited outside the terminal for a while, but didn't go inside, thinking it might anger her further, or that she'd believe they were trying to control her. Then, bizarrely, in case she had gotten lost, they drove out toward Goodnight Scrub National Park, more than an hour southwest of the airport. Surveillance cameras recorded Tanika's car near the park at 10:30 a.m. Did they really believe Phoebe had wandered miles in the opposite direction, even knowing she had already missed her flight? According to James, they found no trace of her and eventually left. News of Phoebe's disappearance spread almost immediately, and by May 16th, she was officially declared missing. Tanika and Jason joined the search efforts as well. They handed out flyers with Phoebe's picture, and Jason even went so far as to offer his old fishing boat as a reward to anyone who knew something about her whereabouts. On the surface, it looked like Jason was doing everything possible to show how badly he wanted Phoebe found. But in reality, his behavior only drew more unwanted attention to himself. After all, a normal person who truly knew where the girl was wouldn't need an old, worn-out boat as an incentive. They would already have gone to the police to share the information and help bring her home. In the days that followed, the mystery of Phoebe's disappearance began to unravel, slowly but unmistakably. Police searched the area around the airport, but found neither the girl nor her belongings. They seized Tanika's car and inside discovered a sawed-off shotgun, 2 replica handguns, and ammunition. It turned out that at the very time Phoebe vanished, Tanika was actually out on parole. Just a few months earlier, on February 24, 2025, she had been stopped by Highway Patrol, and the officer found a sawed-off rifle and a semi-automatic folding knife in her possession. Both items are strictly illegal to own or carry in nearly every Australian state. From that moment on, police began treating both the vehicle and the home where Tanika, Jason, and Phoebe had been living as potential crime scenes. But nothing could prepare them for what they encountered once they stepped inside the house. To call it cluttered or dirty would have been an understatement. The stench hit officers the moment they opened the door, so strong it was almost suffocating. Everywhere they looked, there were piles of clothing, discarded food wrappers, random junk, and dog feces smeared across the floors. The dogs had been defecating indoors, and nobody bothered to clean up. The waste was tracked through the house, spreading from room to room. Mice had infested the property. It was impossible to imagine how anyone could have actually lived there, let alone slept, eaten, or tried to maintain a normal life. The horror didn't stop inside. In the yard, officers found the decomposing bodies of 4 dogs. They had died of natural causes, but had simply been left there, unburied, their stench adding to the sickening atmosphere. The scene was completed by an old rusted-out bus parked near the house, Jason's failed project, which he had been trying in vain to sell. Neighbors had long complained about the constant noise from parties, the filth, the barking dogs, and above all, the overwhelming stench of decay. It's hard to believe that this had once been a beautiful, spacious, carefully designed home, a place filled with wooden details, flooded with natural sunlight. Once the house had belonged to a man, his wife, and their infant child. For them, it had been a haven of comfort and peace. But when the family relocated, they decided to rent the property out to Tanika Bramley. Naturally, the owner did his due diligence before signing the lease. Tanika met all the requirements, and from the beginning, the rent was always paid on time. The lease was in her name, and by the end of last year, she and Jason moved in together, right around the time their relationship began. Tanika was local, She had gone through a divorce and was raising 2 children of her own. Jason had moved to Jinjin after his own marriage fell apart just 6 months earlier. And yet, in less than half a year, the couple managed to transform what had once been a warm, welcoming home into something closer to a landfill. Now the owner would be left with the costly task of cleaning and restoring the property before it could ever be rented again. Of course, Phoebe had a clear understanding of her circumstances. She knew she was living in unsuitable conditions, and in her messages to a friend, she admitted she needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. But after her falling out with her mother and her father's blunt refusal to let her stay with him, Phoebe had very few options left. Still, inside the house, her own room stood out. It was the cleanest space, her belongings neatly arranged, as if she fully intended to return soon. The only disturbing detail was the doorframe, which had been broken, as if someone had forced their way inside. When exactly that had happened remains unknown. Considering the state of the house she lived in, the tensions within her family, and the fact that Gin Gin was a tiny town where nothing ever seemed to happen, Phoebe's desire to leave and finally catch her breath in Perth, a big city where her boyfriend lived, becomes entirely understandable. Levi Rick's father told reporters that he had to move his family after his wife was killed in a car accident on New Year's Eve, 2020. Every day, his children rode the school bus past the crash site, and they simply couldn't bear it anymore. It was too painful. So the family relocated to Perth, but Levi and Phoebe never stopped talking. Every evening, they would connect over video chat, talking for hours. They would fall asleep mid-call, then the next day laugh about who had talked in their sleep. Rick said he thought it was incredibly sweet. At some point, the young couple came up with the idea of going camping together on the southern coast. But for that, Phoebe needed to get to Perth. So she spent months saving money to buy her ticket to Western Australia. Levi, wanting to support her dream of becoming a photographer, bought her a Canon camera worth $1,000. When Phoebe never stepped off the plane in Perth, Levi immediately blamed himself, thinking she had changed her mind. But the truth was far darker. She had never given up on coming to him. The police searched the national park, near which a surveillance camera had captured Tanika's car on the day Phoebe disappeared. On May 23rd, the officers managed to find something interesting related to the case. They did not disclose what exactly was discovered, but after that, they began to search the park area even more thoroughly. The searches were conducted on land, in bodies of water, and from the air using drones, and they also involved cadaver dogs, specially trained to detect human remains. The police continued to keep the details of the case secret, but on the 25th, the search area was expanded, and detectives from the Homicide Division joined the operation. On May 26th, they further extended the search region and discovered several items potentially related to the investigation. The findings were sent to a laboratory for analysis. James and Tanika were arrested. They were charged with murder and mishandling human remains. On June 6th, Phoebe's body was found in the area of Goodnight Scrub National Park. The police did not reveal how the girl died, but it was definitely a homicide. It is important to note that although the remains were found after the couple's arrest, they did not provide any information about where to look for her. The police were able to narrow down the search area using data from Tanika's and James's phones. The police believe that Phoebe was killed while on the way to the airport on May 15th, after which the killers moved her body to a location where it was kept hidden for 2 days before being taken to the park. The police examined the couple's phones, and James's phone contained several curious messages. First, he wrote to a friend who was worried about the search for the girl that Phoebe was a thief. According to him, she had stolen $5,000 and some jewelry from him and Tanika. One might wonder how she could have possibly found anything in the mess the couple had made in their home. In any case, the issue of the money will be clarified in court, but most likely James was just lying to explain why Phoebe had not used her bank account since May 14th. Second, and far more interestingly, in another message to a friend, the man complained that the police were on him because I was one of the last people to see her alive. He wrote this while the girl was still missing and her body had not yet been found. On July 1st, there was another development in the case. The police arrested 30-year-old Kieran Daniel Mittelhauser. He was charged with complicity in the crime related to Phoebe's case. Authorities emphasized that he became an accomplice after the crime had been committed. Kieran used Phoebe's phone to interfere with the police investigation. He manipulated the device and the data on it to hinder efforts to locate Phoebe and determine what had happened to her. The trial of the accused has yet to take place. However, it is possible that there will be no trial if the defendants plead guilty. It has been reported that Tanika and Jason had already split up before their arrest, and there is a likelihood that the former partners could turn against each other to negotiate better plea deals. If that happens, it might reveal the answer to the central question: what could have been the motive for this crime? Why would an adult couple kill a teenage girl? It is unlikely they were simply annoyed by her presence, as there were only a few hours left before her departure. It is possible that drugs were involved. Judging by the condition of their home, this seems plausible. Or perhaps it was about the $5,000 Jason mentioned. Maybe the girl knew something about the couple's dealings, and they feared that, once in Perth and out of their control, she would speak up and tell her boyfriend everything. Or maybe there was no motive at all. They were just on edge on the day of the flight. A minor argument escalated, and during the journey, the situation got out of hand, resulting in the girl being killed. This could have happened in the brief 5 to 8 minute window when Tanika and Jason supposedly went for a walk, giving Phoebe a moment to cool off. In any case, Jason probably did not mention the broken television casually. If they had shown even a little self-control, all of this could have been avoided. Now they will face trial for murder, even though it would have been much simpler just to drive Phoebe to the airport and say goodbye. Phoebe Bishop was so close to leaving, to see her boyfriend, go on a trip, and briefly escape the tension at home and the nightmare she had been living in recently. Yet despite the evidence found and the arrest made in connection with this case, one haunting question remains. Why did this happen to her when happiness was already within reach? Neha was packing her suitcases with anticipation. She and her daughter were getting ready for a trip, just about 2,000 kilometers, and they would be in Miami. The journey promised to be special. Just her and her daughter, only the two of them and no one else. They would sunbathe, lie on the beaches of Miami, swim, ride jet skis, and no one would disturb them. Unfortunately, this trip, which began so wonderfully, would end in tragedy, and it would be a journey from which only one of them would return. At 3:30 a.m. on June 27, 2025, a call came into the Miami Emergency Services from El Portal, a quiet residential neighborhood. The caller was Neha Gupta, a 36-year-old pediatrician from Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Neha reported in a trembling voice that her 4-year-old daughter, Arya Talathi, had fallen into the backyard pool of the house they were renting while her mother was asleep. Emergency responders were immediately dispatched to the address. They arrived just a few minutes after the call. What they found in the backyard was a horrifying scene. 4-year-old Arya was still submerged in the deep end of the pool. She wasn't moving and showed no signs of response. Rescuers were shocked that the mother hadn't yet pulled her daughter from the water. Neha explained that she had, of course, tried to get Arya out for about 10 minutes, but hadn't been able to. She also said she couldn't jump into the pool because she didn't know how to swim. Without wasting a moment, the paramedics pulled Arya out of the water and began performing initial resuscitation, desperately trying to bring the little girl back to life. But Arya showed no response to their efforts. She was carried to the ambulance and rushed to the hospital, where for nearly an hour, doctors and nurses did everything they could to save her. But it was too late. At 4:30 a.m., 1 hour after her mother's call to emergency services, Arya was pronounced dead. The officers took the grieving mother to the station, where they asked her to explain what had happened. She began by saying that 2 days earlier, on June 25th, she and Arya had left Oklahoma, traveling nearly 2,000 kilometers to Miami. Neha had finally gotten the chance to spend time with her daughter, and she decided to take it. It was supposed to be a wonderful vacation, and at first, it was. Upon arriving in Miami, they settled into a spacious house with a swimming pool, which they had rented for a few days. Thursday, June 26th, went perfectly. Neha and Arya spent the day enjoying the warm summer sun, sunbathing, swimming, riding jet skis, and playing on the beach. It was a beautiful time, just for the two of them. They returned to the house sometime between 7 and 8 in the evening. Arya was so tired from all the fun that she fell asleep, and her mother carried her inside and put her to bed. Around 9 o'clock, Neha woke her up so they could have dinner together. They went to bed around midnight, lying down together in the master bedroom, holding each other. The evening had been peaceful and completely normal, but around 3:20 a.m., Neha was awakened by some faint noise. That's when she realized her daughter was no longer in bed, nor in the room. She noticed that the sliding door leading to the pool was open. Neha rushed to the backyard and found her daughter in the pool. The little girl wasn't crying, splashing, or reacting to her mother's shouts. For about 10 minutes, Neha tried to pull her daughter from the water. Only when she understood she couldn't help her on her own did she dial 911. It was the worst kind of tragic accident, the kind that changes a family's life forever in a matter of minutes. A child wakes up in the middle of the night, goes outside without waking the mother, and unnoticed, accidentally falls into the pool. But within just a few hours, the police began to doubt whether what had happened was really an accident. To begin with, experienced detectives were unsettled by the way Neha described the tragedy. Her account sounded too detached, as if it hadn't happened to her at all. They found it hard to believe that Neha, not only a mother but also an experienced pediatrician, could stand at the edge of the pool for 10 minutes, helplessly watching the final moments of her daughter's life. Yes, Neha explained that she didn't know how to swim, but even that excuse didn't hold up under scrutiny. Because if you ask any parent what they would do if they saw their child drowning, the answer would be the same: anything it takes to save them. In such moments, instinct takes over. Fear and logic fall away. Experts call this hysterical strength, a powerful adrenaline-driven response when ordinary people suddenly display strength and courage beyond normal human limits. It's when a person doesn't stop to assess risks or think through options. The body simply acts. These are the same kinds of moments people often hear about. A mother lifting a car with her bare hands to save her child trapped underneath. That's why Neha's behavior shocked investigators. She didn't just fail to jump into the water. She didn't call for help, didn't run to the neighbors, didn't even try to pull Arya from the pool using a stick or a towel. And again, this wasn't just a terrified mother. This was a pediatrician whose career was built on helping children. Yet at the moment when her own child needed her most, she did nothing, even knowing that a 10-minute delay could mean losing her daughter forever. More questions arose when it became clear that the pool wasn't particularly deep. Of course, a 4-year-old couldn't have stood in it, but her mother easily could have. She could have stepped in and reached her daughter while keeping her own head above the water, which led to an obvious question. Why didn't she save her daughter when she clearly could have? The likely answer was found soon enough, back in Oklahoma. For many years, Dr. Neha Gupta had built a reputation as a respected pediatrician. She worked at a hospital affiliated with the University of Oklahoma, which meant that in addition to treating young patients, she also taught at the university, giving lectures to future medical professionals. She was also engaged in research. Her studies on the topic of coronavirus had been published in leading medical journals. In short, she had all the credentials one would expect from a specialist of her caliber. As for her personal life, Neha met, fell in love with, and married a colleague, pediatrician Saurabh Talathi. Before long, the young couple welcomed a beautiful daughter, Arya Talathi. But unfortunately, after Arya's birth, by the spring of 2022, cracks began to appear in the family's once stable life. Neha filed for divorce, and from that moment, tensions only escalated. What followed in court was a fierce battle filled with mutual accusations. In July 2022, Neha sought a protective order against her ex-husband, alleging domestic abuse. The order remained in effect for nearly a year, but when the time came to renew it at the end of 2023, the court denied her request, citing a lack of evidence to support the abuse claims. By the time the divorce was finalized in 2024, the couple's relationship had completely deteriorated. They had become bitter enemies. Neha fought fiercely for sole custody of Arya, but the judge denied her request. She tried to limit the father's visitation rights but failed again. Even her earlier claims of domestic violence, which had once earned her court protection, were dismissed. In the end, the court granted joint custody to both parents. The decision devastated Neha, but unfortunately, it wasn't her last blow or humiliation. In May 2025, just a month before Arya's death, the court dealt her another painful hit. Neha was ordered to pay her ex-husband's legal fees, amounting to about $80,000, and his attorneys filed papers to begin garnishing her wages. By then, her emotional state had already begun to crumble. She started acting erratically. For instance, showing up at Arya's daycare, disrupting staff, and causing scenes. In fact, as far back as 2023, both parents had been ordered to undergo psychological evaluations, but apparently neither Neha nor Saurabh completed them. In 2025, the issue resurfaced, and Saurabh insisted that his ex-wife undergo the evaluation. Neha responded that if she had to do it, then he should too. The dispute ended in May 2025 when the court temporarily transferred full custody of Arya to her father. The final blow came soon after. On May 30th, Neha was terminated from her position at the Children's Hospital and shortly after from her teaching post at the University of Oklahoma. For anyone, such a series of losses would have been overwhelming. Everything Neha had built through years of effort, earning her medical degree, completing her residency at a New York medical center, and building a career in Oklahoma, was gone in an instant. Something inside her broke. She planned a trip without telling anyone about it, not her ex-husband, not the court, and took Aria to Miami. There, she not only chose a rental house with a swimming pool, but also took her daughter jet skiing, even though neither of them could swim. According to security camera footage and rental records, Neha and her daughter were the only occupants of the house during their stay. In other words, there were no witnesses to what happened that night. And the more detectives pieced together the facts, the more it seemed that this trip hadn't been about creating happy memories, but about ensuring that only one of them would ever return. Still, even the most hardened investigators wanted to believe it was a tragic accident, a mother's terrible mistake, until the autopsy results arrived and shattered everything they thought they knew. The medical examiner's report turned the entire case upside down. There was no water in Aria's lungs or stomach, an undeniable finding that completely contradicted her mother's story. It's worth noting that in roughly 15% of drowning cases, no water is found in the lungs. But in this instance, the forensic conclusion was unequivocal. Aria did not drown. In addition, the autopsy revealed bruises and small cuts inside Aria's mouth, on the inner sides of her cheeks. These injuries couldn't have been caused by the paramedics' resuscitation attempts. According to the pathologist, such marks could appear if someone smothered Aria, for example, with a pillow while she struggled to breathe or tried to resist. In such a case, no fingerprints or hand marks would be left on the victim's skin, since the pillow would act as a barrier. The official autopsy report concluded that Aria was already dead before she entered the pool. Her body had been placed in the water afterward, a staged scene meant to make it look like an accidental drowning. Finally, the autopsy exposed another lie in Neha's account. She had told investigators that she woke Aria around 9 p.m. so they could have dinner together. But Aria's stomach was completely empty. The girl had not eaten anything that evening. The secret departure from Oklahoma, the empty stomach of the child, the lack of any meaningful attempt to save her, and the physical evidence proving that the girl had not drowned, all of it led police to suspect that Neha Gupta had tried to cover up a murder, staging it to look like an accidental death in the pool. On July 1st, just 4 days after Aria's death, Miami police obtained a warrant for Neha's arrest. By that time, she had already returned home. Although she hadn't been required to stay in Miami, it struck investigators as highly unusual that a mother would leave her child's body in the morgue and go home so soon. When officers arrived at her house, they announced themselves loudly, identifying as police and asking Neha to open the door. No one responded, though they noticed movement inside. The officers were forced to break down the door and search the house. Eventually, they found the suspect hiding in a pantry, pressed against the wall behind the door. Her attempt to hide did not look good for her. Neha Gupta was charged with first-degree murder. The story immediately exploded across local news outlets and social media. People were horrified. No one could understand how a woman who had dedicated her entire career to saving children's lives could be accused of killing her own daughter. It didn't make sense. Many believed there had to be a mistake, and her lawyers made that argument loudly and clearly. Her defense team insisted that the police had rushed to arrest a grieving mother without completing a full and thorough investigation. They emphasized that Neha had cooperated extensively, speaking to investigators multiple times since the very first day. Even her divorce attorney publicly stated that the idea she could harm her child was utterly inconsistent with her character and the life she had lived. "She's a mother in mourning," he said, "not a criminal." If Neha was truly guilty of killing Aria, then the question is, what could have been her motive? Psychologists who study such crimes generally distinguish 5 possible motives that drive mothers to commit acts this horrific. Accidental, when a mother intends to punish or discipline a child but doesn't mean to kill. Altruistic, when a mother convinces herself that death will somehow spare the child from suffering. Psychotic, when hallucinations or delusions drive her actions. Unwanted child, when the mother sees the child as an obstacle to her goals, whether financial, romantic, or personal. Revenge, when the act is meant not to hurt the child, but to hurt someone else, often the father. Detectives in this case believe the motive was revenge against Neha's ex-husband and Aria's father. Neha was exhausted by loss. She had lost custody, money, her job, and even her professional reputation. She felt defeated, cornered, angry, and vengeful. Nothing in her life was going according to plan. After losing everything, she might have decided to take away from Sohrab the one thing he loved most, their daughter. But she also didn't want to spend the rest of her life in prison, so she allegedly rented the house and staged the death as an accident in the pool. Yet the prosecution's version had a serious weakness. According to their theory, Neha smothered Arya and then placed her body in the pool. But Neha, being a doctor, would have known that an autopsy could easily reveal that Arya hadn't drowned. That inconsistency raised doubts about whether the act was premeditated at all. There was also her own statement. Neha insisted that she had definitely closed the sliding door before going to bed. If she had said something like, "It was hot, so I left the door open," or "I don't remember if I closed it or not," her story might have sounded more believable. But her certainty made her version seem poorly thought out, as though she hadn't rehearsed or planned it. That, detectives realized, might suggest something deeper, that the killing, if it happened, wasn't planned in advance. Nevertheless, the prosecution seemed confident in the strength of the evidence they had gathered. Then, a sensational new development. On August 7th, at a hearing in the case, the prosecution announced that they had dropped the first-degree murder charge against Neha. Instead, she is now being charged with involuntary manslaughter with aggravating circumstances. This shocking news immediately raised two important questions. What actually happened, and would the prosecution even be able to prove the defendant's culpability in Arya's death? Neha's attorney was quick to comment on the news. In his view, the prosecution already realizes that they will not be able to prove that Neha intentionally harmed her daughter. Indeed, despite what seemed to be irrefutable pieces of evidence, such as the signs of strangulation on Arya and the absence of water in her lungs and stomach, it is difficult to believe that her mother acted with intent. On one hand, she might have considered an act of revenge to hurt her ex-husband, inflicting maximum pain in a situation that could no longer be undone. On the other hand, Neha has a medical education, a life full of experience, and obvious intelligence. It is impossible to understand why she would try to stage a drowning accident if she truly intended to kill Arya. Why simulate drowning, knowing that the autopsy would immediately reveal the truth? Why strangle a child and leave marks inside her mouth that clearly indicate staging? If this were a deliberate murder, it was carried out very carelessly, and Neha was never careless. However, Neha's lawyers will also have their work cut out for them in defending a client who has a tendency to lie. Several years ago, Neha Gupta gave an interview discussing a scientific paper she had written on the coronavirus. She answered a series of questions from the journalists, mostly on medical topics. At the end, he asked her to share an interesting fact about her personal life that viewers wouldn't know. Neha responded that she loved extreme sports, such as skydiving, scuba diving, and snorkeling. A person who cannot swim and who was afraid to jump into a shallow pool, yet claims no fear of diving with a snorkel or scuba gear. Neha had lied. But when? During the interview or later in the interrogation room at the station? That is for the court to decide. And if Neha does not accept a plea deal, millions of people, especially parents who will never be able to comprehend how someone devoted to saving children's lives could have killed her own daughter, will follow the trial with unwavering attention. August 15, 2007. Today in the north of France, in Roubaix, Roubaix, a sale is taking place. A huge open-air flea market with mussels, French fries, and beer. Guests come here from Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. At 2:30 in the afternoon, Mustafa Kokakurt returned home from work. He had promised his little son Enes to come early so they could go to the sale together. Enes spent the morning with his grandparents. He and his grandmother stopped by the sale briefly to buy the boy some sneakers. But since a 5-year-old is a little bundle of energy, and it was hard for him to stay with his grandmother for long, she took her grandson home to his grandfather and continued shopping on her own. Fortunately, the sale was literally on the same street where they lived. When Mustafa came home, he was surprised because his son didn't come to greet him. Usually, as soon as Enes heard that his father was home, he would run out to meet him. But not today. Mustafa called, Enes, are you here?" There was no answer. He went out to the terrace where his father Turan was busy with some work. Turan said that just 5 minutes earlier, the boy had been in sight. He was wearing his new sneakers and had asked his grandfather to tie his laces. But the grandfather was busy and asked him to wait a moment. Strange. So where was he? He must have gone outside, the father thought. A 5-year-old child couldn't have gone far. Mustafa ran out into the street, but the boy wasn't there. The father grew worried because it wasn't in his son's nature to wander off alone. Mustafa searched for him in the park behind the house where Enis often played with the neighborhood children. But he wasn't there either. The man searched everywhere, asked all the neighbors, but no one had seen the boy. And that is when he really began to panic. At 15:03, he was already calling the Roubaix police station. The police took the child's disappearance seriously, but they could not rule out the possibility that the boy had simply gotten lost in the dense crowd at the sale. But Mustafa was convinced that his son hadn't just gotten lost in the crowd. The family's neighbors, having learned about the boy's disappearance, hurried to help the worried father. They printed out and began posting Enis's photographs all over the neighborhood. Calls started coming in. Mustafa received calls from all sorts of people claiming they had seen Enis in various parts of the city, but unfortunately, all of these turned out to be false leads. The waiting was unbearable. The father was beside himself when he saw his neighbor returning from the sale with his 2 daughters. Mustafa asked whether Enis had been with them. The man replied that yes, they had seen Enis around 3 o'clock in the afternoon with Mustafa's uncle. But Mustafa had no uncle and never had. However, the neighbors, especially the younger daughter, were certain about what they had seen. The girl gave a very detailed description of this so-called uncle of Mustafa. She insisted it was an elderly man in a cap with a small beard and that he had a cast on his arm, an unusual blue-colored one. Enis was confidently holding the man's hand. The father understood immediately. Someone had kidnapped his little son. The father hurried to the central police station in Roubaix to file a missing person report. He arrived at 1640. By that time, Enis had already been gone for more than 2 hours. And if he had simply gotten lost and someone had tried to help him, he would have been found by now. Considering Enis's young age, the police quickly came to the conclusion that the boy might have been kidnapped, which meant that every minute counted and all possible resources would have to be mobilized to find him quickly. The police distributed the child's photo in all places where he could possibly be. They checked train stations and airports. At the same time, the police were interested in the family situation of the missing child. Investigators found out that the boy lived with his father, and the grandparents helped raise him. Unfortunately, Enis's mother suffered from depression. She had long since shown no interest in the child, although she had once attempted to kidnap him. That incident happened when he was still an infant. The mother took the baby, turned off her phone, and disappeared. Mustafa managed to find them only 15 days later. After that, the juvenile court granted custody to the father, and for 5 years they heard nothing more from the child's mother. The police asked the father whether he was sure she couldn't have kidnapped the boy again. Mustafa was certain it wasn't her. Of course, the police still had to verify this. As far as they knew, Enis's mother had been living in Garges-les-Gonesse, 14 kilometers north of Paris. So their Paris colleagues went straight to her address and found out she no longer lived there. She had returned to her home country, Turkey. Mustafa had been right, although he would have preferred 1,000 times over for her to have been the one who took the boy. After all, he was her son. She would not have harmed him. He would have been safe with her. Mustafa could not rest, convinced that something far more serious had happened to his son. Since the police also had little doubt that the child had been kidnapped and they had a description of the likely kidnapper, they decided to use the Amber Alert Child Abduction Emergency Notification System. This system was new for France. It had been introduced only in 2006, that is, a year earlier. For example, Mustafa had never heard of it and did not understand how it would help his son. The Amber Alert system originally appeared in 1996 after the kidnapping of Amber Renee Hagerman. The girl was kidnapped while she was riding her bicycle. Pierre Bellinger, the CEO of the French radio station Skyrock, after learning about the existence of such a tool, began fighting for the introduction of a similar system in France, and succeeded. To use the system, the case must meet 4 criteria. The kidnapping must be proven, the victim must be a minor. There must be information allowing the identification or clarification of the location of the victim or the kidnapper. And finally, the physical integrity or life of the victim must be in danger. Enis's case met all the criteria, and at 20:45 that same day, the prosecutor made the decision. All television and radio broadcasts exploded with messages about the kidnapping of 5-year-old Enis Coquecourt. Every 15 minutes, the broadcasts were repeated. They flooded the media and shocked people. Just a few hours after the trigger of the abduction alert, the police received 668 calls and 80 letters regarding the case. Checking every lead was not easy, It was a titanic task, but knowing that the life of a 5-year-old child was at stake, the police were ready to work through the night. Out of hundreds of calls, the officers managed to single out 2 that helped them move forward in the investigation. First of all, the owner of the Cafe Metropole called the police. He said that recently a customer had been coming to the cafe who had been in a scooter accident and therefore wore a cast of a rare blue color. So rare that the cafe owner had never seen 2 people with a cast of such a color. And since the man had an excellent memory, he gave the name of this customer, Francis Everard. Francis did not hide it and told the cafe owner that until recently he had been serving a prison sentence. The police immediately found Francis's address in Roubaix in his file. But at the listed address, he did not live. The investigators had no idea where to look for him, but they found out that he had served time in prison for sexual crimes against minors. In fact, he had divided his whole life between assaults and prison. As soon as he was released from prison, he started all over again. Enos really could have been kidnapped by him because the boy fit the profile of his victims. Except, where could they find him? Then the police got lucky, and another important witness contacted them. Taxi driver Xavier Labar also saw the message about the child's abduction and suddenly realized that he had given a ride to a man who matched the description of Francis Everard. Moreover, the man was not alone but with a boy about 5 years old. The taxi driver recognized the boy from the photograph. Xavier said that the man had called a taxi, and when Xavier arrived, the man was standing hand in hand with the child. The boy clearly seemed happy to be with the man. He showed neither fear nor anxiety. The man said they were going to buy toys and some personal things for the child. The ride lasted no more than 10 minutes, and Xavier dropped them off in front of some garage units. 7 hours had already passed since Enos's disappearance when the police, together with the taxi driver, went to the large ring road so that Xavier could show exactly where he had dropped off the man with the child. The detectives called Mustafa to inform him that they had found a lead. They did not know whether Enos was alive or dead, and Mustafa was afraid even to think about what they might discover. Xavier showed the police the place where there were about 30 garage units. The kidnapper and little Enos could have been in one of them. But where to start? Each of the doors was locked with a padlock. The police had no right to break them all open. Besides, they did not know what the kidnapper would do if he heard a raid team breaking into the neighboring units. The police had a K9 unit at their disposal, and they let one of the dogs smell Enos's clothing. The dog immediately picked up the scent and led the handler to one of the units. The officers tried to move as quietly as possible so as not to endanger the child. They did not hear a sound, but the dog was unmistakably pointing to one of the garage boxes. A decision had to be made. The police decided to break the lock and open the garage unit. When they opened the door, they saw that the room was filled to chest height with all sorts of things, furniture and trash. On the floor lay a dirty, worn-out mattress, and on the mattress was a man squinting in the dim light, and a child. The boy was not moving. The police were concerned about his condition and approached carefully. At that moment, the child woke up. The detectives felt incredible relief that he was alive. The officers immediately recognized 61-year-old Francis Everard. The officers immediately arrested the man and took him out of the unit, and Enos was taken to the Roubaix hospital, where he was admitted under an assumed name to protect him from journalists and prying eyes. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, when the officers called Mustafa to inform him that they had found his son, the man simply lost consciousness. He thought they had found his son's body. When he came to, he could not believe that Enos was alive and waiting for him at the hospital. Enos was indeed very weak, but he asked to be allowed to see his father. The boy received first aid, and a doctor examined him, confirming he needed careful medical attention. Meanwhile, the officers examined the crime scene. Inside the unit, it was very dirty. Food scraps and hygiene items were scattered everywhere. In addition, they found some medications and other items that could be of interest to the investigation. Despite what Enos had gone through, the police urgently needed to speak with him. The fact is, a 5-year-old child quickly forgets, and the details in this case were crucial, especially considering that the arrest of Francis Everard had begun, and the police had 48 hours before they would have to release him. Enos said that he did not know how to tie the laces on his new sneakers, and while he was waiting for his grandfather to help him, a man approached him. Enos asked if the man could help him with the laces. The man had a cast on his arm and explained that he could not do it, but asked the boy if he wanted to go look at some toys. The man seemed very friendly, and Enos agreed. The man took him to a garage unit, which the boy called the basement. Inside, it was completely dark. The boy became afraid when he saw a knife, which made him uneasy. Enos understood that what was happening was not normal. He cried and wanted to go home. He eventually fell asleep on the mattress. The investigators used a doll to help the boy explain safely what had happened. The conversation with the child lasted about an hour. After that, Mustafa was finally allowed to enter his son's room. When the father appeared, Enes was smiling. He knew he had gone through something, but did not realize that it was very serious. The father had to play a role in front of his son and pretend that everything was normal. Enes hugged his father very tightly, and Mustafa understood that he had been very scared because he had never hugged him so tightly before. Meanwhile, the detectives began questioning Francis. To the investigators' surprise, he admitted to everything he was accused of. It turned out that he really liked to talk about himself. The man said that he had been released from prison on July 2nd, after which he moved to his hometown of Roubaix. His mother had died, and his remaining relatives did not want anything to do with him. Nevertheless, this was a territory he knew. He went on the hunt and did not deny it. However, in the morning, he was walking down the street with no intention of kidnapping anyone. But he encountered little Enos, who asked him to tie the laces on his new sneakers. Enos turned out to be a very pleasant boy, smiled at the man, and agreed to follow him. They arrived at the garage between 15 o'clock and 15:30 and did not come out again. The man did not deny that he had certain desires, and that was why he took little Enos. As for the knife, he bought it for his personal needs and did not threaten the child with it. Francis also did not dispute that he gave Enos Defalgan, painkiller, in adult doses, as well as Lexomil to make the boy more compliant, so that he could do whatever he wanted with Enos. This is the hell this child went through. Francis knew perfectly well that his actions were illegal and immoral, but he explained that when he felt sexual desire, it was like a wave that washed over him. At the same time, he insisted that he loved children too much for their purity and beauty to go further. Therefore, the idea of him killing the child was out of the question. And then Francis Everard added something that shocked the investigators. He stated that in his lifetime he had committed abuse more than 40 times, but the justice system knew of only 8 victims. After the first 48 hours at the police station, the prosecutor decided to formally charge the man. Francis was born in 1946. He grew up in a popular neighborhood of Roubaix. At the time of the incident involving Enos, he was 61 years old. He committed his first serious offense as a teenager. Since he spent most of his life in prison, he had virtually no close family or friends left. He did not have a job, and one could say he hardly knew life outside of prison. As a teenager, he already began to develop a bad reputation. He was suspected of petty thefts, even though his parents provided him with everything he needed. Francis was placed in a so-called reformatory, and it was there that teachers noticed his problematic behavior. At the age of 12, he underwent his first psychiatric evaluation, and the psychiatrist noted concerning tendencies. But the boy was still very young, and the judge decided to give him a chance. At 14, the teenager returned to his hometown of Roubaix. He did not study, did not work, and for 2 years wandered around the area. On May 14, 1962, the 16-year-old Francis committed a serious offense against a younger child. The next day, he again encountered a child in a public area. Francis was sentenced to 3 months in prison and then transferred to a psychiatric clinic where he spent a year. In 1964, the 18-year-old Francis was released and again committed another offense for which he was sentenced to 18 months in prison. In April 1969, his photo appeared in a newspaper, and a young child recognized him as someone involved in a prior case. But the police could not arrest him immediately because he was already serving a sentence in Belgium for another offense. He was released 4 years later, and early at that. In April 1973, he returned to Roubaix to his mother. He was 27 years old, still unemployed, and rode around the streets on a moped. Only 4 months later, he committed another serious offense. A few days later, the victim identified him, and he received 15 years in prison, but was released after 10. And Francis did not wait even a month before committing another offense. His new case involved a young teenager. His final sentence was handed down in 1999. He was supposed to spend 27 years in prison, but served fewer than 20. He underwent a psychiatric evaluation during which he stated that he still had troubling thoughts, but felt he could control them. As it turned out, that was not the case. In reality, Francis's pattern of offending never changed. He would spot potential victims in public areas. When he encountered Enos, Francis was 61 years old, and he had spent 32 of those years in prison. So his profile as a high-risk individual was clear. His behavior could function only in that harmful pattern. There remained one more important question: the prescription of Viagra to Francis Everard. When journalists learned about this, they raised an outcry and asked, "Isn't this like giving a dangerous person a tool that could increase risk?" Francis said that he received the prescription on June 19th, and on July 2nd, immediately after being released, he went to the pharmacy. He explained that he intended to try to have a normal adult relationship, and since he was not sure he could, he asked the prison doctor to issue him a prescription. He insisted that he did not use the drug in relation to any offenses, but that did not change the fact that the doctor prescribed it. Undoubtedly, this was shocking. The police questioned the doctor very thoroughly. He explained that Francis convinced him that this was a way to help manage his impulses. The doctor believed him and issued the prescription. He was not held accountable because the investigation did not establish a direct link between his action and any criminal behavior. After all, it would still need to be proven that Francis misused the drug in connection with an offense. In addition, the doctor argued that he did not have access to prisoners' records and did not know the details of Francis's sentence. On the other hand, in the prison where Francis was held, 80% of the inmates were serving sentences for serious offenses. Clearly, it was an imperfect system, but in any case, the doctor was not held accountable. The only remaining question is why professionals sometimes make decisions that put themselves and others at risk. This case attracted so much attention that the newly elected president Nicolas Sarkozy could not ignore it. The president promised to pass a law according to which prisoners like Francis, after completing their sentences, would be examined by a medical board, and if the board deemed them dangerous, they would not be released. They would be placed in a secure hospital. This law was indeed passed in 2008. The law allows a person to be kept locked up even if they have already served their sentence, but not everyone welcomed the innovation. Many experts considered this law a violation of human rights and feared legal action from other European countries. They argued that there was no need for this law. It was already sufficient for offenders like Francis to fully serve their sentence and, upon release, comply with all imposed obligations, such as regular visits to a psychiatrist and taking medication for chemical castration. Their opponents argued that these obligations did not help and could not protect little Enos from abuse. Why? Because of absurd bureaucratic red tape. Francis Everard knew exactly how to behave in order to be released early. To begin with, when he was promised that agreeing to chemical castration would be beneficial for him, he began taking the medication that suppresses sexual urges. But as soon as he learned that it would not allow him to be released faster, he automatically refused all forms of medical help. However, since he was a model prisoner, he served only the mandatory term, that is, 18 years instead of 27. Upon release, he was given a series of instructions intended to help him and protect his potential victims. For example, he was forbidden from owning weapons and from contacting minors. In addition, he was required to see a psychiatrist and continue taking medication for chemical castration. But here's the catch. He served his sentence in the prison in the city of Caen. However, upon release, he returned to his hometown of Roubaix. He visited the parole officer, but she had not yet received his documents from Caen. She did not know about his crimes or the conditions of his release, and when, after various bureaucratic procedures, she finally received the documents and called him for a meeting, Francis had already struck and attacked Enos. It should be emphasized that the 2008 law would not have affected Francis in any case, because it was passed after he committed the crime. The trial of the serial abuser began in October 2009. But before the trial began, Francis took a desperate step. He wrote a letter to President Sarkozy requesting the surgical removal of some of his sexual organs. In France, this procedure is illegal, but the defendant insisted that, at his age, he would no longer suffer from it, and it would prevent his inclinations from manifesting. The president apparently did not respond, but Francis's lawyer decided to publish the letter, probably hoping to elicit some leniency for his client. Francis tried to convince the court that he himself had been a victim of abuse in childhood. This allegedly happened at night when he was 10 years old. He was assaulted by a young 22-year-old man, and supposedly this was what predetermined Francis's future inclinations. The problem was that the police could not find any evidence to support this. Moreover, the versions Francis gave constantly changed. Sometimes the abuser was his cousin, sometimes his uncle, sometimes someone else. He could not settle on the details of the assault, and the police did not really believe it had actually happened. The defendant admitted to the attack on Enos, explaining that the desire was like a wave that overwhelms him. He cannot restrain it, cannot resist it, and the justice system should have monitored him better, knowing he was dangerous. The prosecutor stated that the justice system could do nothing for the man. He was irreparable and would seek underage victims regardless. Therefore, the prosecutor demanded life imprisonment, but Francis managed to avoid this sentence. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison, of which he must serve 20. The convict filed an appeal, but then withdrew it. In 2027, Francis will have served 20 years for the kidnapping and assault of Enes Kokokert. At that time, he can petition for sentence reduction and parole. Today, the convict is already preparing the ground for release. He has taken his mother's surname because a recently adopted law gives everyone the right to anonymity, which is very convenient for people who have spent their entire lives destroying families and can now simply change their name and continue committing crimes. There is no death in this criminal case, but that does not mean there is no suffering or misfortune, because the fear of losing a child, once settled in a parent's heart, never goes away. It happened once, and Enes's father, Mustafa, always feared that it could happen again. This is what is frightening, that child molesters can at any moment, in any place, take away what you hold most dear. Fortunately, Enes Kokokert is safe today. He is 23 years old and he is the father of 2 wonderful children. He was surrounded by the love and care of his father, grandmother, and grandfather. He never lacked love, but there always remained the fear that he could be abducted again. Unfortunately, the criminal permanently took from him that childhood innocence and the certainty that everything would be fine and that his father could always protect him.